Even 30 plus years after its release, classic Mega Man still rocks. Since its first appearance in 1987, the series has left its mark on the industry, delighting players and influencing young creators alike. But it's a remarkably difficult formula to get right. Capcom itself has stumbled at times over the years, while certain other projects never really came close. Which is why when Mega Man 11 was quietly announced at the tail end of 2017, I was skeptical yet curious. Does Capcom still have what it takes to create a proper Mega Man game after all this time? Well, after spending the week playing through the final game, I can safely answer that with a resounding yes. With sharp level design, refined mechanics, and a beautiful new visual style, Mega Man 11 is everything I had hoped for and more. But how did Capcom achieve this? Well, that's precisely what we're going to examine today. What is it that makes a Mega Man game great in the first place? How does Mega Man 11 excel and improve upon these key elements? And what about performance across the various platforms it's been released on? Any input latency concerns to consider? We'll answer all that and more in this episode. To fully appreciate Mega Man 11, we need to first consider what it is that makes Mega Man so special in the first place, and how the team has improved upon each element in building this new game. Firstly, there's the stage design. Capcom has opted to build Mega Man 11 with 16:9 widescreen in mind, opening the playfield in the process. This isn't the first widescreen Mega Man game, of course, but it is the first to truly utilize the additional screen space. This wider canvas has enabled the team to push out the level design and introduce new challenges that may not have worked as well in a smaller space. When it comes to crafting these challenges, however, Mega Man 11 wisely channels the classic games. Mega Man is widely recognized for its approach to teaching through level design, right? The idea is that challenges are presented to the player in controlled environments. You learn through doing. Basically, the designer will naturally introduce a new enemy or hazard early in a stage, allowing you to easily recognize and learn how to handle a new threat before combining them together to create more difficult challenges. This is a key element in building a great Mega Man stage. But it's also something that later installments, particularly in the X series, started to lose with the introduction of things like in-game dialogue boxes. By the time we hit those later Mega Man X titles, these dialogue boxes started getting in the way of just playing the game. Combine that with generally less interesting level design, and it's clear why games like Mega Man X6 are not held in high regard. And it's even worse in games like Mighty No. 9. This would-be spiritual successor to the Mega Man series falls completely flat in this regard by pausing to explain just about every single hazard the player might encounter. It's infuriating. Sure, Mega Man 9 features great level design, but it's been 10 years since that game's release, so it was never a given that Capcom could pull this off again with Mega Man 11. Yet, somehow, that's precisely what has happened. The stage design in Mega Man 11 is brilliant and stands tall next to the best games in the series. Firstly, the game retains the aforementioned show rather than tell approach to level design. Take Blast Man's stage for instance. From the very first screen, players learn that fire causes these boxes to explode and disappear. Then one screen over, you learn that these smaller enemies trigger explosions when blasted into those same crates. Next, we're introduced to these tripwires, which cause a series of explosions based on the point of origin for the light beam. You need to run quickly across the boxes as they explode, or simply avoid the explosion altogether. So now we know that these boxes explode, and we understand what triggers an explosion. Now that the player understands the basics of the stage, then, the complexity can be ramped up. All the new elements are laid out clearly right from the start of the stage without ever relying on dialogue boxes. You figure it out by doing, and if you fail in the early section, your only punishment is a little damage taken. Every single stage features its own unique concepts in this sense. From the sliding ice and spikes featured in Tundra Man's stage, to these crazy spheres in Bounce Man's stage, all the way to the crazy flame mechanics featured in Torch Man's level. There are also common elements between stages like this. Again, you see this enemy here and this power-up up here. You can destroy the enemy and continue, or if you observe its attack, you might realize that it's also possible to stand on them temporarily to reach a higher point, which is something that'll come in handy later in the game. Basically, Mega Man 11 nails this aspect of design. The team clearly understands what makes the series so great, and then it takes things further. As suggested earlier, the developers take full advantage of the expanded field of view and increase in screen real estate with a series of stage layouts and challenges pushing beyond the classic series. It's a perfect fusion of modern and classic game design. That's not even getting into the quality of the platforming and enemy placement. Jumps are perfectly designed to feel satisfying but challenging, while enemy placement is simply perfect. Every single block and every inch of the stage is perfectly planned out and aligned. The enemies themselves also follow in the footsteps of the classic games. Each has a clear attack pattern and weak point that keeps the players on their toes. You need to learn to counter these patterns to progress through each stage while juggling multiple enemy types. You really can't just fumble your way through a stage. Which is another area where Mighty No. 9 falls short in comparison. Enemy attacks and placement matters very little in this game. You can just hammer on the attack button and keep holding forward. It doesn't really matter if you take damage or fumble your way through the stage, it simply never requires much in the way of precision. The dash chain system is interesting, I suppose, on paper, but it doesn't really work. The game just isn't that challenging, and without this challenge and the need to learn patterns, the gameplay simply becomes dull and rote after a short while. The loop that is so rewarding in Mega Man is completely absent, and that's exactly where the development team at Capcom has succeeded with this new game. Beyond that, there's no gimmick stages here either. By the time Capcom reached Mega Man 8, for instance, the team introduced things like this boarding segment, or what amounts to a horizontal shooter in Tengu Man stage. You'll find none of this in Mega Man 11, which basically moves the series forward while carrying with it that which makes the original game so good. More than anything else, this is where Mighty No. 9 really dropped the ball. Poor level layouts, poor signposting, and a near constant barrage of dialogue windows basically ruined the experience. Conversely, other games like Shovel Knight and Octahedron understand this classic design and push the genre in new directions. These are developers that have learned from the masters. But great level design also requires perfect control. The Mega Man games rely on sharp, responsive, easy-to-understand controls designed to allow players to deal with challenges quickly and efficiently, at least in the right hands. Mega Man 11 draws from later games in the classic series then, with features such as the slide and charge shot, but improves upon the formula with a few smart additions. Remember Rush? Introduced in Mega Man 3, Rush is designed to assist Mega Man in a variety of ways. But using him requires entering the menu, selecting Rush, and then popping back out into the game screen. This is how it's always worked. In Mega Man 11, however, Rush is now assigned directly to dedicated hotkeys, which summon one of two Rush forms without ever visiting the menu. It's not that it's just more convenient, it also allows players to utilize Rush in quick reaction scenarios such as this. Then there's the double gear system. This is a brand new addition which basically assigns two options to the shoulder buttons. One gear increases Mega Man's power, while the other triggers slow motion. Both are intuitive and simple to use. This also highlights a nice addition to the game. While gameplay itself avoids dialogue boxes and the stages are never interrupted, Capcom did build these small tutorial rooms that pop up after you obtain a Robot Master's power. It's a great way to get a grip on the new powers before using them in a stage. The main point here though is that Mega Man 11 offers excellent responsive controls that are a perfect fit for the series. But just how responsive are they? Well, I did some tests using 240 frames per second video and determined that Mega Man 11 has genuinely low input latency. Keep in mind that these tests are somewhat rough due to the reliance on grainy high-speed footage produced by an iPhone X. Also, this was filmed on an LG C8 OLED, which adds around 21 milliseconds of input latency. So, on Xbox One X then, Mega Man 11 roughly comes in around 62 milliseconds or so, which is on par with the PlayStation 1 era Mega Man games like X4. My Switch results then are slightly higher in comparison, but very close indeed, coming in around 68 milliseconds. PS4 Pro, however, is closer to 90 milliseconds, which is nearly 2 full frames slower than Xbox One X. I'd imagine this is due to a forced triple buffer VSync. Unless a game specifically utilizes an adaptive VSync mode, PS4 games in general tend to use triple buffering, while Xbox games are often double buffered with an adaptive VSync. We've seen this many times with different multi-platform releases, and it might help explain the extra latency here. That said, it still does feel responsive on PS4, but it's clear that the other consoles have an advantage. Keep in mind that filming at 240 FPS is not a surefire way to get an exact number. These are all just rough estimates, but it's clear that PS4 lags behind. Either way, the results are excellent, especially on the Xbox and Switch. It's significantly faster than the X Legacy collection. So at this point, my feeling is that Mega Man 11 features great level design and super sharp controls, but what about the presentation? In designing the game, Capcom has opted to use its internal MT Framework engine again, last seen in Monster Hunter World, but this is a very different looking game. I'd imagine that this engine was selected due primarily to Switch support. Capcom's other major engine, the RE engine powering Resident Evil 7, Devil May Cry 5, and Resident Evil 2 Remake, doesn't currently seem to support the Switch, or at least it didn't when the game went into full production, so MT Framework seems like a good choice. It's also an engine that has proven itself in the past, with games like Marvel vs. Capcom 3 running on a PS Vita at native resolution at 60 frames per second. The selected visual style then channels the feeling of hand-drawn graphics, but relies primarily on 3D models. The texture work is excellent, while dynamic lighting and occasionally even dynamic shadows help spice things up further. I especially love details like the rim lighting drawn into the tree textures here in the background. There's a real sense of artistry to the environments that takes the kind of shading you might have seen in a pixel art game into account in 3D. It's all so vibrant and well designed. This isn't the first side-scrolling Mega Man game built in 3D, mind you. The two PSP games and earlier PS2 entries in the X series are also 3D, but I feel that Mega Man 11 is the most successful in pulling it off. So how does it fare across multiple platforms then? Well, the best news here is that the game is enhanced for Xbox One X and PS4 Pro. In each case, that means a full native 4K presentation with SMAA anti-aliasing at 60 frames per second. With its zoomed out perspective on the action, this leads to a highly refined presentation with super sharp detail. If you jump over to the base consoles then, Mega Man 11 still delivers a great experience, hitting a full 1080p on both consoles with the same SMAA implementation. That means even if you're running a base Xbox One, you'll get an ultra clean and sharp image. And while the added clarity of 4K is certainly welcome, it still looks great on these platforms. The Switch, on the other hand, is a different case. In docked mode, Mega Man 11 is still 1080p just like the other platforms, but it runs without any form of anti-aliasing at all. Which basically means that the game is a lot jaggier than any other version, especially on a larger 4K display. Thankfully, the results on the Switch screen itself are much more pleasing. In portable mode, Mega Man 11 runs at the screen's native 1280 by 720. I've always had a soft spot for portable Mega Man games in the past. I still have my copies of the original Game Boy games, for instance, and of course there's those excellent PSP games. So just having a next generation take on Mega Man in the palm of my hand once again is quite a treat, and it works really well on the Switch. Then of course there's the PC version, which supports a wide range of resolutions but is still very limited in the options department. The PC version is locked to 16:9 widescreen, for instance, with ultra wide resolution simply parking black bars on the left and right. This, however, I'd imagine is due to the game design itself. Many areas are specifically framed for 16:9, and increasing the field of view would either reveal empty space or trigger enemy activations too early, thereby messing up the flow of the stage. Aside from resolution and input latency differences, however, Mega Man 11 looks the same across each and every platform. It's really only the docked Switch experience that falls a little short in my opinion with its lack of anti-aliasing, but honestly, every version is nicely polished in its own right. So the game looks roughly the same across all versions aside from resolution, but what about the frame rate? After all, in an action game like Mega Man, smooth performance is a must. Well, sort of. What I mean is, if you look back at the series, it hasn't always hit the mark in terms of frame rate. The 8-bit NES games often exhibit slowdown and flicker depending on what's happening on screen due to hardware limitations. It's not great. But obviously that did improve over time, and the newer games, especially on PlayStation and Saturn, no longer exhibit such issues. So how about Mega Man 11? Well, let's start with the Xbox One X. Native 4K resolution, 60 frames per second, and not a drop to be found. The gameplay simply does not drop frames, delivering a perfect frame rate at all times. Now, I've played through most of the first 8 stages here on the Xbox One X, and just never ran into any issues at all. It's very smooth. And the same goes for the PlayStation 4 Pro, where I've nearly finished the game. The frame rate simply does not drop here. It's 100% stable 100% of the time. So at this point we're 2 for 2, but can we keep the combo going? Well, on a base PlayStation 4, it seems like we can. I did put less time into this specific version, mind you, only playing through 3 of the stages or so on the base system, but performance remained locked throughout all of my tests. And the same is true of Xbox One S. Again, I didn't put as much time into this specific version, but the stages I played suggest that it is on par with the other versions. And Switch? This is the one that I was a little concerned about, but after spending more time with the game, well, I'm happy to report that Capcom nailed it. It's 100% locked at 60 FPS, again, at least in the stages that I've played on this system. And the same is true of portable mode, which again, it's very smooth, very stable. Which is why I saved the Framerate Analysis portion of the video till the very end, because honestly, it's not that interesting. We get exactly the performance we wanted, and there isn't a lot else to discuss here. But that doesn't mean it's not a huge achievement. While the game isn't pushing any technical boundaries necessarily, you simply cannot take this kind of performance for granted. I only need to bring up the Unreal Engine 3 powered Mighty No. 9 again to illustrate just how badly things can go wrong. Nearly every version of that game exhibits nasty slowdown, which is why Capcom deserves credit for hitting such a stable level of performance across every platform. So at this point, we've established that Mega Man 11 looks, plays, and runs like a dream. But there's one more important element in building a great Mega Man title that I want to discuss briefly, and that is the audio. Primarily, the soundtrack. The original Mega Man games are known the world over for their remarkably catchy music. Nearly every installment in the series has an awesome soundtrack. A catchy soundtrack is critical in designing a side-scrolling action game like this. Without the music to back up the action, the excitement of playing the game is reduced somewhat. Now, initially, I was slightly disappointed by the tracks here due to the instrumentation, but over time, it's really started to grow on me. In fact, certain tracks like Tundra Man are so catchy that I feel that they stand up against the best soundtracks in the series. Just listen. It's great stuff all around. One other element that's both interesting and slightly disappointing is what they call the instrumental music. Selecting this option in the menu triggers a different style of music that sounds more like this. It's a neat alternative to the default soundtrack, but there's an issue. This seems to only be available if you pre-ordered the game. The decision to lock this behind a pre-order is the one and only modern-style concession that the developer made with this game, and it's a shame that it's not just available to everyone. Better yet, it would have been a great reward for completing the game or finishing certain challenges. As for the rest of the audio, well, the sound effects and voices are pretty good, and they do not intrude much on the experience. You don't have to worry about characters buzzing in while you're trying to complete a stage. It's just straight music and sound effects during the gameplay with those occasional cutscenes happening between, just like the NES games. All that is to say then that Mega Man 11 hits all the right notes. Everything that I look for in a Mega Man game is accounted for here and improved upon. While Mega Man 9 is a fantastic throwback style of game in its own right, this is what I've wanted from the series for years now. Mega Man 11 is basically Mega Man's Sonic Mania moment. That moment when a development team manages to fully capture the essence of the classic games while expanding them in new directions. Wait, what was that? Oh yeah, one complaint. When you go through the gates, Mega Man drops like a stone rather than floating through the gates like classic games. Minor thing, but it definitely stands out. Aside from that though, everything else feels like a nice improvement. It doesn't change it so much as to feel like a different series, but it adds just enough while bringing the nostalgia in full force to make for a wonderfully memorable game. There's been a lot of fantastic games in 2018 thus far, but honestly, Mega Man 11 might just be one of my absolute favorites of the year thus far. Sure, a good chunk of that is going to be tied up in nostalgia. I love Mega Man, but I've loved Mega Man for 30 years now. And really, Capcom has let the fans down on numerous occasions, so it was definitely not a given that Mega Man 11 would deliver. But I'm so happy that it has. But that's enough gushing from me for the moment. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give us a like, subscribe, and follow us over on Twitter, and of course ring that notification bell up there. And until next time, keep on playing Mega Man.